her education in school, although it helped her, it also put a barrier between herself and the text. So we've been really trying to just think about, so Mark, we're thinking about these three things: time, remembrance, and kingship. And people, please feel free to interrupt me. And part of the background has kind of been what I described to you in mail as a kind of a semi-Maimonidean approach, meaning we understand Chazal also have a very strong suspicion of images. Right? Ten Commandments, right? So we are trying to think about the way in which the idea of kingship is represented. Now, Maimonides, just as a point of reference, he would say that any predication of the king, of any predication of God, saying anything about God is misunderstanding him. Anything. Even to say, he goes so far as to say, as God is, God has being, to say that of God is to misrepresent him, because it's limiting him by conceptual categories, by linguistic categories. Now, Chazal have the same understanding of, or the same kind of suspicion of idolatry, yet, and for reasons which take us out of the subject here, are much more interested in representation. And in this way, Chazal really are for people who know Milton, very much like Milton, meaning the suspicion of the image, but the strong imperative nonetheless to represent. So we were asking in relationship to Musaf, how is kingship being represented? And in the course of our conversation, we started to ask other questions, meaning once kingship is being represented, you're bringing the divine into space, right? And also into time. And that's another thing that we really noticed in relationship, even to the discussions of kingship, also to the discussions of remembrance, of course, that there's a strong emphasis on time, and really what we started to describe as two temporal realms. One, a kind of eternal perspective, and which is mentioned but inaccessible, and one, a temporal perspective. For Chazal, and please interrupt me, philosophers or physicists, for Chazal, time is a created thing, right? It is something that's created, meaning just as space is created, time is created. And when God comes into the world, he comes into the world not only physically and spatially, it's actually more problematic, but temporally, that God is present through time. I say it's more problematic spatially because you can talk about idols and things which are themselves idolatrous. It's hard to think of time in that manner. And I think, just by the way, for people who are scholars of the 17th century, and Mark, I'd like to ask you about this some other time, I think there's a shift in emphasis from a poetic world in which time is most important, and a physical world in which space is most important. And time is connected to narrative, and space is connected to observation. Whatever, this is my own. Guys, if you want to interrupt me because I'm not making sense and you want to understand me, please stop me. If not, come along for the ride. I just hope I'm being clear, and I'm just noting these things to Mark because we share this philosophical interest. Okay, so we so far spoke about kingship in terms of that representation of the divine in time. And we noted also liturgically, if you are a person who prays 3 times a day, during the 10 days of tshuva, there are several changes in the tefillah, but the most significant one, which we mentioned yesterday, really reflects what I'm talking about, the difference from Hakel HaKadosh to HaMelech HaKadosh, in the third bracha of the Shemona Esrei. Right? It's a sanctification of God's name. God is usually referred to as Hakel HaKadosh. And Hakel is a name of God, which is really God out of time. And the change in Rosh Hashana very much reflects God in time. This goes to another thing that we've been really thinking about, is what are the rabbis trying to do in the creation of this text? What experience are we meant to have? Like, how cognitively or psychologically do I change by saying HaMelech HaKadosh? Meaning, for Chazal, for the sages, I'm not just ticking a box and saying, oh, I marked the time right. I got the right time. But surely for them, who have an appreciation of poetry, and Chazal are the greatest poets who ever lived, right? They have the Midrash. which is, I mean, the most extensive poets who ever lived. They understood that poetry, they understood that tefillah is poetry, and they understood poetry, which we've been defining for the past 3 or 4 months, and not just as, flowery stuff. Poetry is the means through which Chazal understand we are going to experience this holiday. How do they want us to experience it? Meaning, if you're going to spend a half hour on Saturday or Sunday davening, praying the Musaf prayer, why are you doing that? More to the point is, what effects does it have on you? And why, going back to my earlier question, why do the sages represent the divine in this particular way? We talked yesterday also about much of the tefillah, and there are 3 central sections. What are they again? Just for people at home who are following, what are the 3 central sections? Can we do it in English, please?
Kingship, remembrance, and horns, trumpets.
Horns. Okay. The literalism, unnecessary there. But yes, so kingship, remembrance, and shofarot, horns. Okay. I did ask you for the English translation. Okay. Kol hakavod. So as a review, we'll just go over this Mishnah from Rosh Hashana. And we looked at it yesterday, but the sages here in the Mishnah are relating to the creation of this prayer. And they're describing why it is structured in the way that it is, in the way they're answering my question. For Amru lifnei lifane b'Rosh Hashana, Malchiot, Zichronot, Ushafarot. So those 3 things, as Tikva just mentioned, Malchiot, how do we pronounce this properly? Shetamlichuni alechem. Zichronot, Kadei sheyala zichronechem lefanai letova, ubama shofar. So the Tana of the Mishnah is saying, as it were, ventriloquizing God, you will say in front of me, kingship, remembrance, and shofar. Why? Kingship in such a way that you will make me reign upon you. I think that's a reasonable translation, right? Is that what we said last time? That you will make me reign upon you, or that you will take upon yourself for me to be your king. Zichronot, kedei sheyala zichronechem lefanai letova. So here's a metaphor, this idea of remembrances, and we spent time on this yesterday, what exactly remembrances mean. And we asked that philosophical question. The reasonable question is, what does it mean to say that God remembers? God sees all temporal processes at the same time. God doesn't really remember. What is this remembrances? Lefanai letova, ubama shofar. So one of the questions we asked was, the last part of this is, how is this achieved? What is the means through it's achieved? It's achieved by the means of shofar. So we asked yesterday, what is the shofar? What is its antecedent, or are its antecedents? Meaning, I'm already asking the question. What is the bama shofar going back on? Is it going back on just the remembrances, or is it going back on the first part of Malchiot as well? So as I said yesterday, the pashtut is that it's really only going back on this. Because I say that's the pashtut because there's a Rishon, the Ritva, who says it goes on both of them. Meaning he has to be michadesh that it goes back on the 2 of them. Because if he hadn't said what he said, I would just assume the pashtut, which is it only goes on the remembrances. That's just an issue in derech halimut, which the precision of Chazal and the way in which they interpret texts, they don't say unnecessary things. But here in our reading of it, let's say we go like the Ritva, and of course that's not necessarily how we read it, but the Ritva tells us you should read it like this. what does it mean? What efficacy does shofar have? What is it doing in relationship to kingship and remembrances? I'm going to take a breath just to ask, to make sure everybody gets the question, but I asked it clearly enough. Yeah, we got it. Okay, good. Okay, yeah. So Mark, yeah.
So this may be a little bit meta, but what I'm wondering is, so how, so this is the Mishnah, right? We're talking, 100 or so, the year 100 or so. How self-conscious were they, were Chazal, as they were writing this, as they were discussing this, that they were, that what a shofar was, right? I mean, the phenomenological experience of holding and using a shofar, I mean, was radically different from what it was when it was enacted. In other words, a shofar was a martial thing at some point, right? It was there to create awe, right? And the Mishnah was written in a time when Jews were colonized. They were a people who couldn't inspire awe in anything, right? So they're trying to remember a time when, when Jews were able to, bring down the walls of Jericho with their shofar. Right now, now it's a ritual object, and it's only a ritual object. And so the phenomenological experience was different. And I'm wondering if they're self-consciously trying to say, remember that old phenomenological experience.
I think maybe they're doing that, but I also think they're using that image that you create as a way to understand the experience of prayer that they're creating. Meaning, yes, on the one hand, I see Chazal as just shamelessly strong readers, like Milton, right? So I hear that existential angst. To me, it's like Rabbi Akiva when he laughs at the Temple Mount, when he sees the destruction, and everybody's like, oh, you see how, what an optimist Rabbi Akiva it was? The way I see Rabbi Akiva is he's feeling such intense existential pain, and he's cringing as he's smiling. Meaning, I think there's both that consciousness of how small we are in relationship to those shofarot of the Tanakh, but also look at the power of our shofarot. I mean, the sages say, a chacham is better than a navi, right? I mean, there's obviously anxiety there, and you're pointing to that, but they're still not afraid to say it, right? Yeah. And so, and Tikva said yesterday that one of the why remembrances, why this particular metaphor, and she mentioned exactly what you were saying, this idea that somehow, just as this idea of anointment of a king, or also the idea of just the power of, you're saying, of the shofarot themselves, their glory. But I think also the power that they have to, we said, I think yesterday, to anoint the king. And that's, I think, what some of the psukim we saw yesterday in remembrances were doing. Right, and that was Tikva was really emphasizing not the relationship to remembrances, but rather to kingship. That shofar, because of the reasons that you just spoke about, they glorify the king, they anoint the king. Right?
I think the way Ed put it yesterday, if I remember correctly, is that a trumpet makes you aware that you are in the presence of a king, similarly to like the bells on the high priest's clothing.
Right. He not only said that, but he called it a performative utterance, meaning it achieves what it does at that. It does what it says, right? I hereby declare you man and wife. That's a performative utterance. The utterance itself, not an utterance, the blast of the shofar itself, that creates the kingship, right? Okay, so now we have our last problem, the shofar, right? So let's look at that. So far, so good. I tell my students, and I'm not comparing any of you to my students, even my students, that sometimes during class I am really disorganized because I just want to go with the flow. And I have trained my students to interrupt me. They're not afraid to tell me that I'm not making sense. So if I'm not, please stop me. Okay. No, I mean, for me, this is teaching this semester, and I think it's because of COVID, has just really been a changing experience, because you really feel like things matter. So why not, why not go where thought takes you? Mark, did you experience that in any way?
Oh yeah, yeah. It's a whole different experience. You realize the seriousness of what's going on and how the people are affected by all of this, and how you realize that people are sacrificing to be in class in a whole different way, and
Totally
so
feel that.
it
Totally
innately
feel
matters.
that. Totally feel like that.
Yeah.
And you have to remind the students that they're doing that, because they don't remember that they are doing that. It's like my quick political thing. Well, I'm not going to say anything. Just, it's so interesting, but it's like yeah. Anyway, so it is. We do feel that urgency, I think, and part of that urgency is really just going where thought takes you. Now, okay, so the first bracha ended Mikadesh et Yisrael that Yom HaZikaron, right? That was, Yom HaZikaron was mentioned in relationship to Malchut. Here it's Baruch Hashem Zocher HaBrit. This is for the end of remembrances, and we talked a little bit about the temporal aspect of remembrances. We'll come back to it. We're going to look at the bracha of the shofar as well, and I just want to keep things in mind here. Also, one of the things that we did see in remembrances is there was an emphasis, you can go back, there was an emphasis on God revealing all secrets and knowing all things, that the metaphor of Gilui occurs three times in the remembrance section, this idea of God knowing everything. Now we'll see that's repeated here. You can check me later to see if I'm right about that. Now we go to shofar, and the first thing that's emphasized is Gilui, right? So I'm going to ask you to, Tikva, can you read this again? And I'm going to interrupt you like we did yesterday. We're going to read it in Hebrew,
Sure.
right?
I think, yeah, I just want to point out before I start that here it's a revelate that God is being revealed to us, whereas in the previous one, it's we are being revealed to God. God sees everything
Okay, so
that is hidden from us.
that's helpful. So one more time. So there, God he's the agent of revelation, and we are revealed.
Right.
And here it's God revealing himself to us. Okay, that's how we'll start out with that. Okay.
Right. Okay. אתה נגלית בענן כבודך על עם קודשך לדבר עמם.
Okay, so you wait. I'm going to interrupt you. So you revealed yourself ba'anan kavodecha al am kadshecha l'deber imam, right? You teach a whole theology course on this one pasuk, right? You revealed yourself, really? And this idea of revelation is not uncommon in Tanakh or in Chumash. It's through concealment. The Kabbalists didn't make it up, right? How do you reveal yourself? In your cloud, right? Right. So that there's very often that dynamic. It's something that's embraced by Kabbalists. We saw it in Milton as well, right? This idea that revelation only happens as a kind of concealment, meaning metaphor itself is a kind of revelation, but it is also a kind of concealment, because the metaphor is limiting, right? The Chazal understand that, and that's what, when they talk about the Ein Sof, that's just an exclamation point to what I'm saying. How does the Ein Sof get into the world, right? And it's problematic. And whatever is chosen as a means of representation is in exclusion of everything else, which doesn't make it less important, but the revelation itself is done in the context of concealment. How could God reveal himself?
It's not very concealed. We just haven't hit that bit yet.
Which bit haven't we hit? Oh, it's going to be revealed. We mean you have this. There's a coming attraction. There's a coming attraction in this in the verses here. Yes. Okay, we'll see. So wait. So I'm continuing my theology course. I'm Kodshecho. So not only does God reveal Himself, but He reveals His glory to His special people, His holy people. And not only that, but He speaks to them. So God apparently reveals Himself as a holy people, and He actually talks to them. Go ahead. And I guess those are all three forms of revelation. Wait, one is you revealed yourself in the cloud. I guess upon your holy people. That one thing or two things, and then the Deber Imam. That's a second or a third thing. Go ahead. Min hashamayim.
Min hashamayim hishmatam kolecha v'nigleta alehem ba'arpelei tohar.
Nice. So there's that same idea of concealment in Revelation. You revealed yourself in your, what is arpelei tohar, in your pure clouds.
Your mists, I think.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. גם כל העולם כולו חל מפניך, ובריות בראשית חרדו ממך, what did he do? בהגלותך מלכנו על הר סיני ללמד לעמך תורה ומצוות.
So I have to go a little more.
That's already a minute.
I have to go a little more slowly here. So upon all the world. How do you translate this? The entire. Let's just see what they have over here. So the entire world quivered before you, and the works of creation trembled before you. When you are king. Where's the king part? When you are king. So when you are king, revealed yourself upon Har Sinai to teach your nation Torah u'mitzvot. Okay. So what are the temporal frames here?
This is past.
No, I understand it's past, but is it one time or two times that are getting spoken about here?
One time.
Okay, so the entire world quivered before you. Oh, and the entire works of creation trembled before you. I got confused because of Maaseh Bereshit, because of the Ubriot Bereshit, I just associated back to the creation. But really, we're talking about the revelation in Har Sinai, and the revelation of Har Sinai, and Tikva already mentioned this, also has an ethical aspect, apparently, or a pedagogical aspect, right? To teach your nation Torah and mitzvot. So it seems two things. One is Torah, some kind of teaching, and also mitzvot. And I'm separating them now, even though I know they're together. Mitzvot, there are things that you have to do. Okay, so this is a continuation of God's revelation, and we've mentioned two temporal frames. I mentioned Bereshit just because of the word there, and also Har Sinai. Go ahead, Tikva. Oh, you're not with us? You're back with us? V'tashmi'em.
My sister kicked me back.
Oh, okay, good. Just biter, as they say. Yeah. Tashmi'em.
V'tashmi'em et hod kolecha v'divrot kodshecha milhavot ish.
So what's happening over
Another
here?
type of revelation. Fire.
You let them hear the majestic splendor of your voice and your holy words from flames of fire amidst thunder. Okay, and so what are the forms of revelation here? Voices and thunders I revealed to you. So that's one thing. Oh, B'kol Shofar Aleim Hofata. I showed myself to you.
It's a hard one to translate.
No, what does it say? Professor Lerner, what does it say here? Here, just translate this for us. No, here.
Professor Lerner, you're
B'kol shofar,
Applies to make an appearance. To
he made us make an appearance, or he made an appearance?
no, he made an appearance. He put on a show.
it's performative.
Yeah, it's performed.
Well, and it's a visual metaphor. God makes himself present to us. Yeah, Mark.
You mentioned you could, spend a whole theology seminar on this, and
Right.
so I just want to mention something that just has been popping out the last 2 minutes. Right, there seems to be three things going on, or three frames of reference in a sense. Right, if God reveals himself to people, right, there are three sort of aspects to this. There's the objective aspect of like God changing himself to reveal himself, God doing something to be revealed.
You mean objective, not in the subjective objective sense, but objectifying himself in some sense.
No, I mean in the objective subjective sense, right? I mean, bear with me for a sec.
Okay.
Right, so in one way, like if I revealed myself to you, right, I could change me, right, so that something about me gets revealed. Secondly, you could change your subjective perspective and get the revelation.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a third thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or you could change the medium by which we both exist, so that revelation becomes apparent. And it seems like this section is straddling all three, or going back and forth between, right, God speaking, there's a cloud appearing by which
Right.
God gets revealed in,
Right.
and the people get understanding, right? So we seem to be jumping back between these three different layers of revelation, if you will. Not layers, but perspectives on revelation.
I wish all my other students were from Milton were here, because it's so interesting to get a different disciplinary perspective, because our languages, even though we talk about the same things, our languages are very different. I mean, so I would translate what you're saying into saying that for Chazal, it's not like the object, and Mark, you will disagree with me, and we can talk about it some other time, that the object comes into being through that activity of interpretation. I mean, and the way I see it is a kind of an Aristotelian way, just like for Aristotle, form and matter are really just poles, they're extremes, right? Soloveitchik himself, this, right, says they're just on a continuum. They don't exist more than theoretically, right? The poles themselves. So for me, that's the same thing with subject and object. That the interpretation only comes into interpretation is what brings things into reality, right? And I understand we have very different disciplinary perspectives. Mine is informed by a certain understanding of metaphor. I don't want to just get too distracted in that, but it's as interesting as it is. But I think what you're emphasizing is that switching back and forth between different perspectives, that is certainly there, right? So God making an appearance.
May I ask for clarification?
Yeah.
So what I heard you saying is that there are different ways a revelation can happen. There's a revelation that happens when the perceiver is changed, and there's a revelation that happens when the object of revelation is changed.
That's
and
what
then
he said.
A change that there's a revelation that happens when the setting is changed.
That's what he said.
That's what he said?
That was a very good review. Thank you.
Right.
Okay, so continue reading, please.
Okay. V'nema.
V'yehi, I think.
אוקיי, ויהי ביום השלישי בהיות הבוקר, ויהי קולות וברקים וענן כבד על ההר וקול שופר חזק מאוד, ויחרד כל העם אשר במחנה.
It's very dramatic, actually, right? So again, there's this revelation through concealment, v'anan kaved, right? When it's the real thing, when it's the real revelation, there's all kinds of concealment, right? In fact, the revelation that the people of Israel get is almost non-existent, right? It's one word, one sound, whatever, right? According to the Rishonim or whatever, or Chazal. V'kol shofar chazak ma'od. Can we forget what we learned in the Little Midrash said, or when we went to Hebrew day school, and actually think about what this might mean? Why does the text mention chazak ma'od? V'kol shofar chazak ma'od. I'm going to ask you also to restrain yourself and not say what you learned in day school.
What's the day school version? I've forgotten.
What Rashi says, no?
I've forgotten. You tell me.
So isn't it? So right. So I think Chazal say, or certainly Rashi says that this is a shofar blast that, unlike normal shofar blasts that are finite, this is not only something that is not finite; it just gets louder and louder. I think in my explanation of it, I think I just interpreted it. There's something about this shofar which is eternal, which is not limited by the finite.
And then you can connect it to Mashiach coming, and
well, then we connect it back to our temporal conversation yesterday in thinking about how Rosh Hashana asks us to think about two levels of time at the same time. One is where we live in that moment where we are commanded, or I'm thinking of that word pakad. Miriam, who came the first time, also mentioned pakad, meaning pikadon, investing something in the future. God invests us with the future, meaning he gives us a mission, but that's the temporal perspective we occupy. But there's also a tikva just referred to, the sound of the shofar, that is eternal, in which we're in another context. And that goes back to what Mark was saying, really, that we're going between these perspectives. And I think from some point of view, one perspective is time as finite, time as creation, and the other is perspective where time is not limited. Okay, so now we get to the psukim. And we talked yesterday also, I think it's worth repeating, that when we read these prayers, we have to think about the art of quotation. Why do Chazal use these three texts? Right? Why do they choose them? What is the poetic effect that they see in them? I mean, on the one hand, I notice myself being much more careful now because we have a philosopher here. On the one hand, you just want to say, well, they needed proof texts, right? They just said all these things, and now they want to bring proof texts. But this whole thing is this creative act. They said these things, and now they're bringing these verses not only to prove what came before, but also to kind of complement what came before. It's almost in the order. It's strange. It's almost like the psukim are a commentary on their prayer, right?
It's worth noting that, the Tanakh is such a rich source. They have so many verses to choose.
Exactly.
The verses
right.
they didn't choose
Exactly.
and why they didn't choose them are almost as important as the verses they did.
Very good. And that's another version of revelation and concealment, right? Whatever they're choosing to reveal some things, and they're concealing others in the process. So here is the proof text. Go ahead, Tikva.
Okay. ונאמר ויהי קול השופר הולך וחזק מאוד, משה ידבר והאלוהים יעננו בקול.
So we get this. He reveals maybe that's where Rashi says that. It keeps on getting louder and louder. Moshe yedaber Elokim ya'anenu b'kol. So Moshe spoke, and God answered us in a voice.
It's future tense. Moses will speak, and God will answer him in voice.
And God answered him by voice. So we already read the first proof text. Here's the second one. Okay, sorry about that. And God, and here, what is their translation here? It's always easier for me to see it. So the first one was on the third day as morning dawned, there was thunder and lightning and a dense cloud over the mountain, and the sound of the shofar was exceedingly loud, and all the people in the camp trembled. And it is said, and the sound of the shofar, which is what we just read, became increasingly louder. Moshe spoke, and God answered him by voice. Wow, so this is strange, because Moshe speaks. How many utterances are there here? I mean, the shofar is called call, right? So you have the call of the shofar. You have the speech of Moses, and you have the call of God. Wow, you could almost teach a poetry course here, couldn't you? Right? There's the call of the shofar, there's the speech of man, and then the call of the divine. That is super cool, right? So somehow, I mean, I was just noticing the cool part. Wow, look at this religion. Man speaks and God answers. How weird. How can they say that? You know, make believe you're an anthropologist from another planet. How can they say that? Not only does God reveal himself, but man speaks and God answers. Answers.
Well, it's certainly a parallel to, you know, the revelation with Adam, where man doesn't speak and God answers. It's a God to man only.
Nice, very nice.
Communication.
But also, just to emphasize, because we're talking about shofar here, what is the relationship between shofar and divine revelation? It seems they're put very close here, right? And the next verse.
כל העם רואים את הקולות ואת הלפידים ואת קול השופר ואת ההר עשן וירא העם וינועו ויעמדו מרחוק.
All the people saw the sounds and the flames and the sound of the shofar, the mountain and the smoke, and the people saw and were shaken and stood from afar. See, Revelation, you know, they're in as Mark will know, in Immanuel Kant in the 18th century, right? 18th century, wrote about the sublime. And in a way, this is the paradigm sublime experience. An aesthetic experience. I mean, for sublime, I think the aesthetic, whatever, and I think this, Mark could correct me, the aesthetic and the theological and the divine, they overlap. That the aesthetic, in a way, is a pathway to the divine. And for Kant, and I'm totally oversimplifying here again, I know philosophers here, the sublime experience is where you're pulled up short, where you're not able to take something in. Something confounds your perceptual categories. Right, so that's what's happening in Revelation, right? It's something that goes beyond your ability to experience, and you see that represented here. Here are the holy words.
This is a weird choice.
Okay, and here we get from Tuvim. I think this is all from Tehillim, pretty much. I think this is, we mentioned the one name for the holiday that is in the Torah is Yom HaTruah. Right, and I'm sure if you've ever gone to synagogue, as Tikva will read this, you might want to break out singing because it's so familiar. This is one of the melody. Really, the words carry the melody very easily. That's what the way they're composed. Okay, so read it all through. Yeah.
The whole thing.
Yes.
Okay. ובדברי קודשך כתוב לאמור עלה אלוהים בתרועה אדוני בקול שופר.
I'm sorry, yeah, I do want you to read the whole thing, but let's stop there. So God, what does it mean that God goes up? God goes up, he becomes, what does that mean?
Who knows? It's Tehillim.
When I first started becoming religious, I was at somebody's house, and there was a young woman there who read Tehillim in Yiddish, because it was apparently told to her by some of the people who were bringing her close to Judaism that it was better to read them. Oh, no, sorry. I'm sorry, stupid me. She read them in Hebrew, but did not understand Hebrew, right? And she was told it's better to read them in Hebrew than to read them in translation, right? So we try not to be of that school, right? Because we think Judaism is a religion that's based upon cognition and thinking, right? So yeah, Tehillim heart. You're right, Tikva. Tehillim heart. So God goes up, betruah, Hashem b'kol shofar. Wow. So what does that even mean? God is ascended with a blast, God with the sound of his shofar. I mean, we just read the words. I now understand the full force of what Tikva said. Can somebody explain this? No. I have to embarrass Professor Lerner, who's Rabbi Professor Lerner, and he gives shirim on Tanakh. So what do we do with this pasuk?
Well, it's some kind of coronation. It's going back, if you look in the context in Tehillim Mem Zayin, which is the chapter we say before blowing shofar. It's a whole The whole chapter is talking about the
I see.
the coronation of
The coronation
natural
of the king, as it were. He
king,
goes
yeah.
up, right, like we were saying before.
He's,
Okay.
yeah, it's
Worth noting,
honored by the.
we're talking about going up. The bit in the previous verse, it talks about how, well, the verse after the verse quoted, it talks about how God goes down onto the mountain.
Mhm.
So you have God going down on the mountain to talk to the Jewish people, and then here you have God ascending with the shofar.
Mhm. Okay, Venemar, go ahead here.
Okay, בחצוצרות ובקול שופר הריעו לפני המלך אדוני.
What does Haril mean?
Cheer, I think. Think of like a roaring crowd.
Rabbi? What is this? Do we have a
No,
witness?
Rabbi, but it could be it could also be just like truah and making sound.
It could be what she said, which was cheer, praise.
Raise your voices.
Raise your voices. Okay. Okay.
Okay, now the long one. Oh, no, not the long one. ונאמר תקעו בחודש שופר בכסה ליום חגנו.
What is that? What does that mean? B'kesa liyom chagenu?
I don't actually know what a kesa is.
We say it a lot during the prayers, and I never know what it is every year. Where is a step? Shimon, what is that?
It has some meaning of being hidden, but I know what Chazal say.
So what do Chazal say? What do Chazal say?
Chazal say that the Rosh Hashana, since it's the beginning of the month, the new moon is still hidden.
See, well, that's exactly right. This idea, the day of the renewal is when the moon is still hidden. But the day of the revelation is when the moon is still hidden. Okay. We're going to try, we'll finish by 5:15. And then we go, let's look at, oh, here, let's not skip this part. So we go to the Nevi'im. And let's go with this Venemar.
Okay. והיה ביום ההוא יתקע בשופר גדול, ובאו העובדים מארץ אשור והנידחים בארץ מצרים והשתחוו לאדוני בהר הקודש בירושלים.
Wow, that's so. But even before translating it, what's the force of this verse? I mean, I'm not saying not to translate it. I just meant it's this messianic future, right? This b'shofar gadol. So we have mentioned now three temporal realms. We've mentioned Bereshit, we mentioned Har Sinai, and now we're mentioning the shofar gadol. So it seems that the shofar, the blast of the shofar come at significant moments in time. We spoke about when we read that book by Frank Kermode called The Sense of an Ending. We talked about two versions of time, chronos and kairos, chronos being chronological time, and kairos being, in Greek, this idea of the fullness of time. And at certain points, and we said this in Milton, right? At certain points, you experience the fullness of time. Even though you're living in the present, you feel the past and the future. And these three moments, these are the paradigmatic moments in the Jewish tradition where you've experienced the fullness of time, or really better, from which the fullness of time for other possibilities of the fullness of time emanate. Meaning we see the story of the beginning, the significant beginning, Bereshit, which is mentioned, I realize it's only elusively, Har Sinai, which is the significant middle of Revelation, and then the Shofar Gadol. So the shofar, we asked at the very beginning of our discussions, what's the relationship between shofar and time? It's a very clear relationship here, right? The shofar not only comes into history as a means of revelation, or better, it comes into history as a means of revelation, but that revelation is a revelation of time, of what time means and how time is structured. You can stop me now. I realize that I'm saying things that are not simple and debatable. But I think part of the divine revelation is the revelation of time. I mean, I know what happened on Har Sinai is not a revelation of time, it's a revelation of Torah. But it's a revelation of the possibility of the significance of time.
Can I also say, it also, I mean, pops out at you that it's invoking space, right? I mean, we're talking about faraway places,
right.
Ashur, Mitzrayim, right? So it's not just back then and in the future, but it's all over, right? Where you used to be, rather.
Uh-huh. You see the nostalgia throughout the prayers, I can tell, right? Yeah. Right. Okay. So what is the, if what I'm saying is true, and time is a form of revelation, how does that relate to Rosh Hashanah? Or why is my understanding of time important on Rosh Hashanah? I mean, we've seen it throughout, right? In the first in Malchut, we saw this emphasis on time. In Remembrance, there's an obvious emphasis on time. Here, in the discussion of Shofar, the emphasis is again on times.
Well, if we go back to the idea of the eternal shofar blow, it's as though there's this eternal coronation of God, and Rosh Hashanah is this time where we kind of we have a moment of contact with the eternal, where we are present at that eternal coronation.
All right. So, okay. Also, I think, and this, and I hope we'll continue this discussion next week when we talk a little bit about Yom Kippur, the idea of past and future and present, or having an idea of time as teleological, time as leading to something, right? Time teleological is telos, right? Has an end. It's Kermod's book, A Sense of an Ending. The idea of time with an ending, towards which one is striving, an aspirational future. Without that, tshuva is impossible. But let's keep that. We're not talking about that now. That's for next. That's to make sure that you come next week. Okay. Okay. So
more opportunities to show off.
So can you continue with the prayer that we're reading here?
Sure.
This is the last part.
תקע בשופר גדול לחירותנו, ושא נס לקבץ גלויותינו, וקרב פזורנו מבין הגויים, ונפוצותינו כנס בירכתי ארץ, והביאנו לציון עירך ברינה, ולירושלים בית מקדשך שמחת עולם, ושם נעשה לפניך קורבנות חבותינו כמצווה עלינו בתורתך, על ידי משה אבותיך מפי כבודך כאמור.
So this just going back to what we were saying earlier, this as Mark points out has the temporal and it's a shofar gadol, again that temporal aspect that I'm pointing out, but also this end of exile. Besimchat olam, what does that mean? Besimchat olam? Eternal joy. I'd love that, right? Because it gets more and more spatially specific, right? Tzion, Yerushalayim, Mikdashecha, Besimchat Olam, right? The spatial is there, but it contracts, and even as it contracts, and this is really, again, you could do a theology class on this. This is the nature. This is a one way of understanding a significant principle in Judaism, that it's through the particular that the universal gets expressed. We get more and more and more local, and then we go to the eternal. And then we go back to the completely local, and we're going to bring you sacrifices, right? Right? What could be more local and temporal than that? Ubiyom, go ahead from here.
Yeah. וביום שמחתכם ובמועדיכם ובראשי חודשיכם ותקעתם בחצוצרות על עולותיכם ועל זבחי שלמיכם והיו לכם לזיכרון לפני אלוהיכם אני אדוני אלוהיכם.
Right, so let's just read the last part. So you're going to bring these sacrifices. V'hayu lachem lezikaron lifnei Elokim Elohechem Hashem Elokeinu. How do you translate that?
Hmm.
And there will be a memorial for you before your God. I am Hashem. I am Hashem, your God.
Your God, who's that? That's me.
Wait, slow down, Tikva. Okay, you're going a little fast for me here. In front of your God, right? So that's a name of God, and here is God as unnameable, meaning without name. Ani Hashem, your God. A little bit of a chiasmus also, right? Right? Ani Hashem Elohechem Elohechem. Oh wow, poetry, right? So here's the Chatima. Ki ato shomea kol shofar umazin trua ve'en dom elach. This is a really wild bracha. Baruch atah Hashem shomea kol truat Hashem amo Yisrael barachamim. What? Ki ata. So you are the one who hears the kol shofar, and you listen to the sound of the trua. And there is nothing like you. Is there any other bracha that we know in the liturgy that says this? Ein dom all of a sudden, the Chazal are Maimonides? Why is this here?
Oh, it's in the second bracha of the Amida.
Mido melach, right. Okay. It's right before, okay. It's a little, there it's in the negative, which is, let's not get into that at the moment. But what does it mean? What does it mean that God hears the sound of the shofar and listens to the truah?
Well, I think.
Wait, let's just feel the question for a second. I got to mute everybody because I'm hearing an echo. I don't know whose that is. Okay, now I'm not hearing myself. We'll see what happens. Oh, now I am hearing myself. Is that you, Shaman? Okay, so you can all unmute yourselves if you want to. Yeah, I thought everything we were doing up until this point was we blow the shofar, right? And you read the Rambam, right? Because we want to arouse tshuva in ourselves. God hears the shofar, and everything we've been saying up until this point has been about God's revelation. Almost everything.
Not this last bit.
What's that?
This last bit is about it's about the shofar as a gathering point of how a bit like how a camp counselor would blow a whistle to gather all their campers. So we blow the shofar to gather ourselves together.
So the guy who blows the shofar is the head counselor, and God is just watching to make sure everybody's behaving. It seems like there's a little bit more going on here, especially since we're getting shomea umazin, both of those things. What does it mean that God is listening? And how is that related to ein dom elach? It seems to be suggesting that there is something about the fact that God listens to the sound of the shofar, that God listens to this human creation that makes him it's not like in the Shemona Esrei Mido Malach. There's nothing else like you in regard to this. So what is it about this which is so significant? That's a good question, right? Baruch atah Hashem shomea kol truat amo b'Yisrael barachamim. Before, when the activity was qualified, it was simcha, but it was our simcha. Right now, the activity is qualified; it's with barachamim. Maybe that's the reason for the simcha, because God, we feel that rachamim. That what is our knowledge of God hearing the shofar mean for us? God hears us. God hears us performing this commandment. So I assume that gives him pleasure. I'm being completely anthropomorphic here. So let's say that gives God pleasure. But what in particular about this mitzvah of shofar gives God pleasure? It gives God pleasure that we're arousing ourselves to know him, to be aware of him, right? The whole point of tshuva, as we've seen, is, or not, whatever, the davening here that we've looked at so far emphasizes this idea of kingship, of turning God into king. And I think maybe the king expresses pleasure that he sees us rousing ourselves to become good subjects to him. And and he gets pleasure in that. And surely that pleasure has to inform our worship and prayer. Meaning he's not just a bystander checking it off and saying, okay, they did that one, right? They're doing this one, and this one in particular brings me pleasure because they're remembering me. And we said yesterday we had two interpretations of that, they're remembering me. One was Ed's, they remember me and therefore they remember themselves. That is, they remember me and therefore, it's kind of Hasidic here, they remember me and therefore they remember their essential selves as holy. I guess you don't have to do it that way. But what I suggested was they remember me, and through their memory of me, I will remember them. L'tova. Because we said God doesn't really remember. It's all anthropomorphic anyway. So when man remembers, God kaviyachol remembers man. And we said that's the dual meaning of pakad. We're really rocking here. That's the dual meaning of pakad, which is both to appoint and remember.
If I may add something.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yesterday. So yesterday Ed said something really amazing that I've been thinking about, which is that we remember God to remember ourselves.
Mm.
And
that's what Ed said.
Right. Yeah. And one of the ways I interpret that is that we remember the divine in ourselves.
Right. I mean, that's kind of what I was referring to before when I said that's a little bit panimiot Hasidish, right? That meaning, how do you conceive of the soul? I mean, in just since a philosopher is here, Hasidim tend to believe much more in the ontological reality of holiness and the soul, right? They believe in holiness as a quality, while I think other movements, I would say normative, Soloveitchik, normative representative of Judaism, even though he was crazy, is that holiness is cognitive. It's based upon understanding or something. But I wanted to go back to what I said, that God remembers, by us remembering God, he remembers us. He remembers us in that term of pakad. He remembers us in time. He remembered Sarah in time. But there's also that idea of pakad, that he appoints us. He gives us a mission for the future. I'm a little bit free associating here. Anybody want to pick things up here? Question, comment? Yeah, Mark, go ahead.
I'm getting a little concerned here. So in the prayer we have, right, we did all this stuff, right? We
Right.
assembled, we gathered, we, you know, somebody blew the whistle, we all came running, we formed ourselves up in lines, and we,
You guys have
know,
to do it. You have to do a screenplay together for the prayers, right? It's very, very visual. Yeah, I'm with you. Sorry.
yeah, right. So, right, you know, there's a very, you know, there's a lot of work we just put in to get together and to, you know, make you king and to, or rather, you know, acknowledge your kingship or whatever. And, you know, then we realize, you know, at that point, I think people realize then the ball is in the leader's court, right? The ball is in the court of somebody who can now say, okay, you've all come together and now you're cannon fodder, right? I'm going to use you as I please.
Well, who's the leader here?
God.
Uh-huh.
Right. So we've assembled ourselves before God.
Where is that implication that we can use you as cannon fodder?
I think the implication is that, you know, when people assemble themselves, right, they, you know, before their leader,
they render themselves vulnerable.
Right, because now the leader has all the power, right? And the leader could say, okay, I've called you together.
Right.
You did what I said. You made your sacrifices. You assembled in Jerusalem because I told you to.
Right.
And you know you have no choice but to do what I say.
Right.
And then we acknowledge, well, okay, you're the God who heard our assembly, who acknowledged our assembly, yet barachamim, right? You're treating us, you know, you're not going to abuse us.
So you would not see the same emphasis on agency then, meaning I see much more implicit in that sense of agency, that the call of the shofar does have this performative aspect. I mean, I really hear where you're coming from, but for me, even that word pakad, which I still haven't gotten to the clarity that we had yesterday, from the one point of view, pakad means remembrance in this divine sense. From the other sense, meaning I remember you, God remembers as it were, because he sees all time and history at once. But there's that other pakad of investing, right? A pikadon, like Miriam, who from the first time said, I'm investing you in your future. You make your future. You look forward to the possibility of a future time. And that I think also goes along with the importance of the aspirational aspect of the representation of time here, which allows for aspiration. I think there's the importance for the way Chazal want us to experience this, to allow us to think that maybe there's a future. And I think that's one of Mark and I were talking before about the way in which we teach differently now. And I think one of the reasons we teach differently now is because the assumption of a future is now questioned for people your age, especially. But on the one hand, and it's terrifying, in a way, as Mark was saying before, it's also a revelation, because people who were in the track through which they were really a version of people who our lives are predetermined, because time was completely mapped out for them, right? All of us here probably know people who we went to high school with who did that, right? Their time is mapped out by, I mean, everybody's like this. Most people are like this. Most people are in the Platonic cave, right? We do things because that's how it works. And Corona for many students, I think, there's been that opening, that inkling. Wow, right? Time is a terrifying thing, right? I mean, I think Augustine is the first one to really get the full feel of that, right? This idea of time as being part of eternity.
May I respond to Mark, please?
I feel like I'm now like George Papadopoulos on ABC. I'm not the moderator. You can talk. Go ahead.
Okay. I think that, you talk about being at, that we are at God's mercy and we are kind of trusting God to not abuse us. I feel like there's this two-sided sentence. There's the you are our king and we are at your mercy. And Rosh Hashana is the you are our king, and Yom Kippur is we are at your mercy. And there are two liturgical poems I've been looking into Yom Kippur that are about that.
so you can share them for us at some point. Maybe next time you'll send them to us. But I think really now, just to go back to what we said we would do, and I think we've done it. We really talked about the relationship between all of these things, and to emphasize that Chazal, when they put these prayers together, do it, I think, because they want to create an experience, and all the liturgical changes in the prayer for the 10 days are part of that experience. And I think, the reason I say I'm so grateful for this is for like 20 or 30 years, I've been thinking of all of these things during the prayer, and being able to say it and to speak it and to talk it out together for the last 3 classes has just been so helpful to me. Meaning just to be able to and I'm hoping really, somebody saw my lecture our class last time, and said, you should have given a lecture, it would have been clearer. And that's not been the point of this. The point of this has kind of been to just create a bunch of questions and to open up certain things. And I think we've succeeded at that, right? I really do think we've succeeded at that. So thank you all. I'm happy to so let's say Chag Sameach, Shana Tova. I'm going to just get some water. I'll stick around for another 5 or 10 minutes if people want to chat. Mark, I'd be happy to chat with you for another 5 minutes if you're around. Yeah, okay, so I'll be right back.
Thank you. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova. The recording while I'm here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.